in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
Pick your spots, you got to pick the timing, and you have to be, if you're going to go out and do a hard session, your body has to be prepared for that. You can't just go down that rabbit hole time in and time again, because you're just going to end up really stunting the ability to get better and grow.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Aaron Geiser, where we're going to answer the question, should you be training like a pro? Aaron, welcome back to the show.
It's wonderful to be back in your presence.
Yeah, man. That's why it's called the present, right? Because it's always a present to be here, right? Let's start off the show with the corniest line you can possibly have. So if you made it,
we're going to pull him in with that one, I'm sure.
If you made it past that 30 seconds, today we really, Aaron and I, text offline and we talk about topics that we think would be relevant to the audience and the viewership of the podcast. And one thing that we were thinking about was this idea of, should you be training like a pro? Because I think a lot of us, right, type A age group individuals who are striving to be better, we want to emulate what elite level athletes are doing. And it can be a little bit of a sticky situation. I've had athletes in the past who are like, well, I have friends and professional athletes that I know that are training 15, 20, 30 hours a week. Should I be doing that as well? Like, that's my goal, is to try to get up to that volume. And, most of the time, I think it's generally inappropriate for them, especially where they're at, right? If you're only working out 5 hours a week right now, it doesn't make sense to try to jump up to 30. That's more a product of the work that has been done over years and years and years, rather than the secret formula for how to get better. So what I wanted to do today is I just wanted to get Aaron's take on that. He coaches a wide variety of individuals, from pro triathletes. By the way, how did they do at Ironman Florida?
We had a good weekend. We anytime that you're kind of stepping into that environment for the first time, it can be very, very overwhelming. And one of the reasons why I wanted to be there with Meg was to give her that confidence, but also that stability leading into the event, to just make sure things went as smoothly as possible. And we put together a really, really good day, and we both walked away feeling like we have a springboard to what's to come in the future. Having checked that first box, sometimes there's a lot of things that can kind of come up and trip you up. We were able to get over a lot of those obstacles, and now it's every start's just another start, rather than, it's the first. So we had a really, really good weekend, and it was excellent spending some time with her through the course of the week. And that time is invaluable with your athletes when you get that chance to be face to face. You get that time to kind of be around them. There's one, you're developing the relationship. Two, you kind of see some of the day-to-day things that go on, and get a better picture of that, and how to help coach them through the future also kind of comes and shares some light with that too.
Cool. So that was her first professional Ironman race?
Let's just say first professional race. It happened to be a full distance Ironman. It wasn't her first full distance Ironman, but
right.
It was her first first pro event. So
awesome.
We kind of jumped in both feet in the water that day.
Yeah, that's great. And it probably, from an athlete perspective, felt really good to have you as the coach there, because then, if she was making any glaring mistakes, you'd be like, hey, Meg, why are you doing that? Let's tweak it a little bit, right? You're the guide to, a little bit more success. You don't want to have an athlete, kind of, show up to the start line and kind of be, so anxious that the race is already over before it's even begun.
Right. Well, and I like to think of myself as a pretty calm, cool, collected individual. And I think having individuals around you in that scenario, in whether it's your first professional race or you're just racing, I think surrounding yourself with individuals that are with like entrenched in the moment, not thinking about all of these uncontrollable variables, can be very, very beneficial because it just kind of gives you that North Star. It gives
Mm-hmm.
you that calmness around you that you really do need to get the most out of yourself and get the most out of the moment. Because sometimes, if I mean, we've all been around individuals that either make us anxious or are just controlling things that they can't control, and it makes everybody else around them a nervous wreck. And I really feel I enjoy being around my athletes leading into a race just because I know what I'm going to provide them is stability.
Mm-hmm.
And often that can really springboard you to a much more confident and better result just because we're doing this together, but we're just, hey, this didn't go according to plan. We're going to move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, this did. Let's just continue to build on that. And it's really just allowing the moment to take the shape and not let the unpredictable take advantage of you and start to control the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's this idea between an internal or external locus of control, right? Like the more you can, internally kind of control and guide, and then let go of the things that just like, oh well, packet pickup, something got messed up, and they didn't have my documentation correctly. Okay, well, what do I have to do in order to fix that, rather than, oh, this always happens, my packet got messed up and now everything's ruined, sort of deal, because it didn't happen exactly the way that you had it planned in your mind. And I'm sure there's so many people out there, because I do the exact same thing. I have an event or something like that, and I visualize what's going to happen, and then inevitably it doesn't go the way that I envisioned it happening. It's the same thing with like conversations, right? Or like work, or really anything in life. But
Most of our
the
daily lives.
yeah, exactly. So if you, I think for me, what I found most valuable is exactly that. It's like, okay, well, it's okay to have a plan, and it's okay to be prepared, because that allows you to then mitigate, kind of those external factors. But those external factors are always there. And 99.9% of the time, we're going to guess wrong on how it's going to be, but it's how you respond, not react to those
Mm-hmm.
external factors, that's really going to either drive an anxiety response, or say, okay, I'm going to stay calm. And having somebody around, like a good coach, is really good modeling for how to respond to that. Right. So I that's like that's just me saying that it probably really helped to calm the nerves of Meg. And I don't know her, whatsoever, but having somebody who's calm around you, especially, for something as big as your first professional race, that's a big deal. So that's good. That's good that you guys had successes. Obviously, there's probably things you guys need to, want to work on, going forward. Um, but yeah, did you have any other athletes racing down there, or was it just Meg?
I had a number of other athletes. They had solid days. So, I mean, it
Cool.
was one of those where weather kind of worked out. Swim probably started out a little bit choppy, and this is one of those unique full distance Ironman where you exit the water and head back in. So it's gets very, very congested because the better the swimmer you are, you're gonna get into the wash of
Mm,
swimmers that might not be anywhere close to your level, and probably a good number of them. So it's one of those where you just got to stay calm in the moment, stay calm in the swim, because there is going to be a lot of arms and a lot of feet that are going to be like, typically most great swimmers get out front and they don't have to deal with that type of congestion. But having kind of that Aussie exit coming out and coming back in, you just have a lot more going on in this particular swim event because you're mixing it back up with people that are on their first loop and you're on your second.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, no matter what direction that you try to navigate, you're running into people no matter where you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I also heard that there was a number of people who were getting like stung by jellyfish during the swim. So, and that's something, right? You can't control that because you don't
No.
know when the jellyfish are going to be, floating by. So, talk about external factors, right, affecting that. And that's something that actually could really affect your day, right?
Oh,
Is getting stung
absolutely.
by a
And
jellyfish.
I mean, they weren't there at all, I want to say, on Thursday. They started to come in on Friday and were 100% present on Saturday for the race. So, if you would have swam Wednesday or Thursday, you might not have even had a clue that they were out there until you got into the water that day. And there was just massive amounts. And typically when you're swimming through jellyfish, what's going to happen? You're going to get stung.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not allowing that to change your perspective and change the moment, because if you did all the training, you want to at least get out of the swim portion of
Mm-hmm.
it in that case.
Yeah, that is one of the big reasons why I prefer freshwater to saltwater is, like like talking about, like, I like to control my swimming by being in
Mm-hmm.
freshwater because that eliminates the potential for getting stung by a jellyfish. But like you can't control that sort of stuff. So it's like, okay, well, how do we mitigate those issues? And I'm sure, like, okay, go see medical staff when you get out of the water, get some ointment, get some treatment. If you're obviously having like an allergic reaction, like, do what you need to do. But like I've never actually been stung by a jellyfish. So like, does it how does it feel, and then how does it affect you?
So, I mean, different jellyfish have different stinging sensations, of
Right.
course. This particular, from, like, I'm not one that signs up for races that typically does have jellyfish anyway, so I've never actually gone through the stinging process.
Mm-hmm.
But some of them can be very, like, burning sensation. Others, it just kind of almost feels like a pricking situation. So I just take it that there's a lot of different reactions and a lot of different feels that are going to be
Mm.
associated. Because, I mean, let's say that you walk up to three people, you pinch them, probably each one of those individuals is going to feel slightly different sensation
Mm-hmm.
between, like, what that feels. So it's very individualized. It's hard to, it's almost, you just have to be prepared for it. And
Yeah.
when it happens, either you have that moment of, oh shit, or you have that moment of, okay, it's not a big deal, and just move forward. And if you're in that scenario where it's a shock to you, it's okay for you to take a second, get your wits about you, and then get back. The worst thing that you can probably do is continue to get stung, continue to allow yourself to get more and more panic stricken
Mm-hmm.
or freaked out, and allow that to really go off the rails. It's okay if you just kind of, okay, let's get my composure, let's get back into it. But I think when you go into that scenario, you just have to be prepared that this is going to happen. And when it first happened, you just react in the moment and be smart within that reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Then get your composure and get back into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't start this podcast thinking we were going to talk about jellyfish stings and stuff like that, but
We, we,
that's
we really made it about 5 minutes into this and started going
I know.
sideways.
That's I was just telling you offline that my brain kind of functions a little bit differently, and maybe that's a ADD thing or something like that. But this is, so I think that's all valuable information, right? For somebody who is, trying to compete in half Ironmans, even like, the sprint triathlons and stuff like that. There is a possibility, if you're in salt water, that could be getting stung, and it's how you handle it that's really going to affect the outcome of the race. But you can go into it being prepared, being like, okay, well, what's my plan um, for if I do get stung, because it is a reality of the sport. So I guess along those lines, let's start to talk about, this idea of people trying to emulate the professionals. And I think a lot of this starts or has started from either like, you know, case reports of there's a perfect example of this. There was like either Norwegian, like, you know, some, I think, Scandinavian speed skater, and he released his training plan to everybody. And it was like, you know, he was doing tons of cycling work, and he was doing, you know, high intensity, low intensity, tons and tons of volume and all of that. And he didn't get into, you know, speed skating until like, you know, like, I don't know, a few months out before actually training. And then he had really good success with that. So that's one example. Another example that strikes me is this big, you know, emphasis on doing the Norwegian training method, which is like the double lactate training days, and, you know, in all of this, because they've now had success using double lactate training days very specifically to allow them to accumulate volume and speed at volumes of race speed that wasn't really, you know, done before. And then, of course, researchers, you know, like myself and Dr. Jacobs included, you know, we generally look at, you know, like the elite level athletes. Okay, well, what are they doing? What's their training distribution? What, you know, how do they respond to, you know, like a certain training intervention? What performance predictors actually predict their performance? So I think it's, you know, it's not surprising to me that a lot of people want to emulate what the pros are doing. But I think something, or where I want to start this conversation is, how do you see this from a coaching perspective? And then how do you maybe pull the reins back on somebody who's like, oh, I want to try the Norwegian training method because that's going to be the next thing to get me better?
And Phil, I really think that this probably was more kicked up by YouTube, the introduction of YouTube following around athletes, seeing what a daily training life was like in that perspective. I feel like that's kind of where it got its start. And then, of course, as you have either individuals or groups start to show success, then that information is shared, and then that kind of rolls down. But I really feel like probably this got really, really popular with, I mean, we all probably have
Social
watched
media,
Lionel
right?
Sanders or and other individuals of that level go in. And I mean, Lionel does some things to himself, and or had in the past done some things to himself in training that just, I mean, it's impressive to watch, but it's also gets somebody, well, I want to train like that. They get them so like pumped up and jacked up. And there is a time and a place for hard workouts, as we've kind of talked on some of the other previous podcasts, but it's also, you got to do it in the right spots. You got to pick your spots. You got to pick the timing, and you have to be, if you're going to go out and do a hard session, your body has to be prepared for that. You can't just go down that rabbit hole time in and time again, because you're just going to end up really stunting the ability to get better and grow. So when it really, I don't have a whole lot of conversations this way, Phil, to be completely honest with you, because whether it just be the credibility that I've built up or the athletes that are coming to me, they feel like I'm going to provide them with the right guidance. And when Aaron says that it's the right time to do this, it is the right time to do this. Then that's not to say that I don't get questions of, hey, why don't we do this particular session, or why don't we go through these particular sessions in this particular block? And I'm happy to have those conversations, but I really feel like I can't answer that really, really knowledgeably, just because I'm not put into those situations. And even if I am presented with the question of, well, why are we going down this route, like this style of training compared to that style of training, I really just kind of step back and utilize science as my guide, because that is what Endure IQ at our foundation makes recommendations based on,
Mm-hmm.
we go with the science. When we have decisions to be made, yes, we're going to take that personal interaction involved in that decision making, but our decision is most definitely going to be made on a science like outlook. So when I present that to the athlete, okay, makes sense, let's go for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a real simple conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had a number of people reach out to me on my Instagram saying like, oh, well, what do you think of the Norwegian method? And then, and then the conversation, this is how it goes. It says, okay, well, what are you doing currently? Like, that's what I always ask people, like where to get a baseline, where are they at in terms of their training? Are they doing intense stuff? Are they doing easier stuff? Are they doing kind of a combination in the middle? And then I start to ask, okay, well, what do you think the benefits of, the Norwegian method would be for you? And they say, well, I think it will help me improve my performance because, because it's helped them improve their performance. And then I start to ask them, well, I always step back to the basics, right? It first starts with specificity, consistency, and progressive overload. And then what you go to is you say, okay, well, you stand to make the most adaptations with something you haven't done before. So, for example, if you have an individual who has always just done zone 2 work, like you shouldn't do this, but always done zone 2 work, and they're like, oh, well, I just need to get better. It's like, okay, well, maybe we need to put in some really high intensity stuff, right? Because that is going to be such a novel stimulus that it's going to actually stress your body to a point that you should adapt as long as you're recovering from it, right? So, and it's keeping it simple. Like, everyone asks me, oh, what's the best VO2 max workout? What's the optimal way to improve your VO2 max? All of that sort of stuff. And 9 times out of 10, I'm like, okay, 3 to 5 minutes on, 3 to 5 minutes off, and repeat that 3 to 5 times, because that's time and time again what's really been shown to improve VO2 max. And yes, there's other research that does show like, oh, if you do a VO2 max workout with X workout, once every other day, your VO2 max is going to be improved more. But the reason why we don't use that is because maybe that's not optimal for our ability to actually adapt. Like, that sort of stuff can be hard to adapt to.
And with this thought, like I liked your motivational interviewing right there, where you're asking them questions to provide you back with some feedback. But
Mm-hmm.
I really still, I mean, to add on to why you're asking those questions, it really, the answer lies in what have you been doing? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you physically cannot go from 5 hours or 6 hours worth of training to 23 hours worth of training in the form of a week and then sustain that for long periods of time. It's just
Mm-hmm.
not realistic. And also, you're going to flip the switch on your energy system so much that they're not going to be able to keep up with that load, and you're not going to progress because it's such an aggressive implementation of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it really, I am a coach that, I mean, I take advantage of as much time available in training that I possibly can, but it is always that progressive approach where
Mm-hmm.
we're adding 5 or 10, or depending on what, like we can add a little bit more maybe on the bike or a little bit more in the running, or not running, in the swim. I do not go over that level in the run
Mm-hmm.
because of the impact forces, unless they're using something like a lever movement system or Alter G or even some underwater treadmill work, just because
Mm-hmm.
it does reduce some of those pounding on the body and joints, but, or impact forces, I should say. So with this, it always comes back to where are you?
Mm-hmm.
And what are you doing in the moment? Because no matter what article you read, if you're only doing 5 hours, and I say only relatively speaking, if you're doing 5 hours of training, that's great. But if you're only doing 5 hours of training and want to get to 15, the only way to get from point A to point B is to draw a linear line from that 5 to the 15 and allow that to be a progression over a good 8 to 10 week period of time,
Mm-hmm.
you will get there, but your body's going to be able to absorb all that training rather than you just saying, well, this week's 5, next week's 10, the week after that's 15. That's not a
Yeah.
very solid progressive theory there. And
Right.
again, you're going to run into problems and you're going to become overly tired. And as we talked about last week, kind of that position of functionally overreaching or non-functionally overreaching, you're going to go into that non-functionally overreaching phase, and you're not going to be able to make the adaptations and the progress because you went so hard in the aggressive progression
Mm-hmm.
that your body is just trying to always catch up over the next 4 to 5 weeks in that case.
Yeah. And I that is a perfect way to think about it, right? If we go back to our three, and this is, everyone's going to be, sick of me saying this by the time, 5 years into this podcast, but specificity, consistency, and progression. And this is where you have to be realistic with yourself, right? Maybe you are striving to be a professional athlete or something along those lines, and you want to eventually get to the volume that a lot of pros are doing. But another thing we have to think about is, and we talked about this last week too, is how much time do you actually have to train? Because it's not realistic for somebody who's working 80 hours in a high stress job to try to then, pile on 20 more hours of training. That's a heck of a work week, and that is not sustainable for most people. There are for some, but it's one of those things where I've had people who have come to me and they've like been on a really aggressive build, and they're like, oh yeah, crushing it, crushing it, crushing it, crushing it, maybe like 4, 6, 8 weeks, and then all of a sudden they're just like plateaued, or they're, plummeting because they hit the cliff and they kept going, and they weren't recovering correctly, they weren't managing their stress correctly, and it just became too overwhelming, and they became burnt out, and then they were like, well, I don't want to do this anymore. And that's where having a coach is going to be there to say, okay, well, this is realistically where you're starting right now. It's 5 hours of training a week. And I remember reading a bunch of research back in the day I don't know if it actually if the head researcher got in trouble about this or not, but essentially what he was doing is he was trying to look at what's the appropriate amount, or what's the maximal amount of increase in volume per week that you can really have for most people. And because of course research, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get population statistics. And I think they came up with 10%. So 10% per week is kind of that upper boundary. That doesn't mean you have to hit 10% per week. And I've made this mistake, and I was thinking about it today when I was biking. Just because your zone 2 is at 180 watts does not mean you have to ride at 180 watts. You can ride lower than that. You can still get adaptations, just like you can progress slower than 10% and still get adaptations and still gain good fitness out of that. So I think that's really what people should focus on, right? If your goal is to increase volume to try to emulate what the pros are doing, see where you're at and then slowly build that over time. Because Eliud Kipchoge wasn't always running, I don't know, 180 kilometers a week, right?
Yeah.
That's been over the course of his, how old is he? Like mid 30s, probably.
I think he's on the back half of 30s now,
Okay.
isn't
Yeah.
he?
He's almost 40, but he's been probably training, since he's, like teenager, maybe even younger than that. And, even before that, he was accumulating volume because most of the time, kids in Kenya have to walk, like 5 to 10K to and from school. So they're accumulating tons and tons of volume, right? So it's not realistic. Like, he didn't start with 180 kilometers per week, but he built up to that. And that's where he's, and so that's where he's at now. So you have to then take that with a grain of salt, take a step back, say, okay, well, this is where I'm starting from, and maybe I can get there. Maybe I can get up to, where like Cam Levins is, or Calvin Kiptum, or like those crazy guys. But I also don't think for most of us that's even realistic in terms of actually like trying to get there. because you're not a professional athlete. So now let's kind of roll it in. I'll let you do your comment, and then I want to roll it into something.
Here, I mean, I think the thing that we haven't even brought up is these individuals that we're bringing up and these individuals that you're reading about have a team of professionals
Yes.
around them week in and week out, whether they're looking at blood constantly, whether they're looking at like if it's a nutritionist getting involved into their nutrition, if it's a sleep study, that there are so many different, like, the individuals that we talk about are the individuals that are having articles published on them have a group of individuals and a team around them that is looking at almost like, let's take Olaf. I mean, he's around that Norwegian theory or Norwegian style of training. We have talked to him. We've had information of what he's keeping track of, what he's getting, and he's around them all the time. But it's not even just him. There's another 6 to 8, maybe even 10 people that are part of that team that are continuing to stay in contact with those individuals nonstop. If you're I hate to say just an age grouper, but if you are, the reality is you're probably not surrounded around that type of team.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to look at that as, well, my life is just a little bit different than that. So maybe that's not the best environment that I need to stick myself into from a training regime anyway.
Right.
It's even with other level pros, we have more people looking at either data or getting involved into all levels of their fitness or their training level, from nutrition to sleep to the training itself. And it recognize that if you don't have that out there, you're already at one disadvantage that doesn't even start with where you're even starting, I guess, too.
Yeah. No, that was exactly what you read my mind, because I was going to say the lifestyle of those high level professionals is much different than even the entry level professional. I say entry level, but like the first time professionals, right? And which is totally different than the age groupers, which is totally different than just like kind of your weekend warrior. So you have to put that into perspective, because what you don't see is the fact that Eliud Kipchoge goes out, does his morning run, comes back, food is probably all prepared for him. His, like they do show him like he's seems to be a pretty humble person. Like, he's sweeping like the floors and like doing other things like that. But he has the ability to just go and relax. Whereas most of us, it would be, okay, I got to get out the door by 5 a.m. so I can do my run, do my workout, be done and ready to then get the kids ready for school by 7. And then I got to be out the door by 8 because I got to be at work at 9 because I have a commute and stuff like that. And then you're going and, and then you work all day, which is, yes, you might be sedentary, but there's tons of stresses involved with that. And exactly like what we were talking about with the stress bucket analogy, right? The more faucets you have going in, the more holes you need to poke in the bottom in order to keep those levels from overflowing. And I think, something that's underappreciated about like the professionals and what people talk about when you actually start listening is they say, oh, well, a professional, like, if they go to the pool, it's like, okay, get in, go to the pool. It's like 9 or 10 a.m., do their workout, hang out by the pool for a little while after the workout. They're not rushing everywhere, like because other people are handling that stressful stuff. Right. And that's like the most successful pros, you see a team around them. And I have a really cool example of this. I'm fortunate enough to know Brett Kirby, who's the, kind of like the pinnacle point lead physiologist on the Nike Breaking 2 project. And I've been able to talk to him about, okay, well, how do you facilitate development of your athletes? Because he's the one that's overlooking, kind of like these really high level professional athletes. And he's like, well, he has to interact with the coaches, he has to interact with the nutritionists, with the physiologists, and like an athlete will come to him and he'll be like, okay, well, have some conversations, see what the athlete's doing, see what the athlete isn't doing, kind of doing that motivational interviewing like we were talking about. And then if he runs up into like a wall, like, oh, I'm not comfortable talking about like nutrition, or I'm not 100% comfortable talking about sports psychology, they have people that they can point them to, and they say, okay, well, I'm going to set you up with an appointment for the sports psychologist. That's something that's completely different. I don't know how many age groupers have a sports psychologist other than just their coach, right? um so, or like a nutritionist, it's your coach is generally your sports psychologist, your nutritionist, to some extent, your the person that's prescribing training, the person that's kind of looking at your volume and monitoring that. And then on top of it, if you don't have a coach and you are self-coached, that's that's adding on another layer of challenge, because I mean, myself included, it's one of those things where um I overestimate how much I can actually do on a given day or on a given week. And that's gotten me into trouble sometimes, right? I always overestimate how well I'm doing. So then I do a few runs that are a little bit too hard, go on something that's a little bit too ambitious, and then I get some weird aches and pains in my Achilles. And then it's like, okay, well, now I got to rest. Or for example, I just started working with a coach, and we haven't even gotten to the training plan stuff. she's she's just been asking me about, like, okay, well, how's your sleep? How's your digestion? How's your mood throughout the day? Like, she's getting an idea of like the whole picture of things. And again, I think we have a tendency to overlook that sort of stuff because, we're living in whatever life it is we've created. And it's really hard to get an outside lens or outside scope unless you're always constantly being, unless you're super introspective, which is just challenging to do.
And then then you start to factor in some of these harder workouts, and that's when it really ends up boiling over too. And it's like everything that you talked about is spot on. And then we haven't even gotten into like the actual specific workout yet, and we've talked about all these other things. And workouts often look a heck of a lot easier on paper or on your training software than when you're in the middle of a really hard workout. I can't say how many times I'm in Zwift leading a ride. I know that this workout is just a punisher. But then you have that one person that's looking onto the side of the screen saying, oh, this one looks pretty good, pretty easy. Like, oh boy, I'm going to tear your legs off. And then halfway through, like I've had a couple of people say that and not make it to the end of the ride.
Yeah.
They've just they just disappeared because one, they definitely over or underestimated that workout. And then two, they didn't really want to be seen the rest of the ride because they couldn't make it through. And they said, oh yeah, this one looks easy. So there's a lot of things. It's a lot more complex than just reading an article and saying, that looks like a good way to get down. Let's go do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too, you touched on, I think, how just social media in general kind of has pushed us in this direction a little bit more of trying to follow what this person is doing, what this personality is doing, and it kind of opens a door to see the behind the scenes sort of thing, for better or for worse, right? And we also have an issue that we've talked about is, for most of us, we feel more rewarded by going harder and doing things that are higher intensity. So when you see, your favorite motivational YouTuber release a new video that's just like, you got to wake up at 4 a.m. and you got to grind and you got to work super hard, and then you got to go to work and work super hard, and you got to just be a superhuman and work super hard. That's the type of culture we're kind of living in. And again, like, yes, that might work, for some of those individuals, but on the in the grand scheme of things, on the whole, we need to manage our stresses as much as we possibly can. And it's the the you know eh, we also have to remind ourselves that a lot of these professional athletes are also capable of doing these super what are deemed superhuman feats, right? So when we look at their workouts and they're running, I don't know what would be fast in kilometers per hour, they're running 6-minute miles for 20 miles, and that's their long run, but that's like an easy long run for them. Then we look at it, we're like, oh well, if I run 7-minute miles, like that should be pretty easy, because compared, it's like, no, it's not, like, because if you like, but that's kind of, we skew it in our mind, right? And actually I have a perfect example of this. So my dad and my uncle, and my dad always tells me this story because it's actually pretty funny. My uncle watched like the Olympics at one point and saw somebody run the mile, or it was probably the 1500, but in like 3 minutes and I don't know 40 seconds. It's like, oh, okay, like, I mean, that's pretty fast, but like I could run a mile in 5 minutes. So he bet my dad that over the course, I think, of like 6 months to a year, that he'd be able to run under 5 minutes. And granted, I think my uncle was probably, he was in shape, but he had never done too much running or like anything like that. And, this is before the YouTube days for sure, before the internet days, even more. And, he was so confident that he was going to run a sub 5-minute mile. And I don't even think he broke 6 minutes in his pursuit of running a sub 5-minute mile. And it's because, we skew in our minds what these athletes can actually do. And then we say, oh, well, if I just back it off a little bit, I can get there, right? That's a realistic goal. When in all actuality, it's like, if I looked at the, like the fastest 5K is under 13 minutes. That's super fast. And I said, okay, well, 13 minutes. Okay, well, I should be able to run, like if I'm 3 minutes slower, 3 minutes slower, I should be able to run, a 16-minute 5K. And my best ever was 16:10, so it's like, it's one of those things. And that was when, I was doing, 60, 70 miles a week. I was, in my mind's eye, following all the proper nutrition and doing all of that sort of stuff and staying consistent with my workouts and recovering well, because I was actually in school. And actually, like, being in school is kind of can be nice, because you have the ability to have all the food there that's always prepared for you. You can, go to class, come back, take naps at weird times in the day. Like, you don't have, a super dedicated, like schedule. 9 to 5 is your work schedule. It can be, pretty all over the place. So actually, that's one thing that's like, oh, well, if you're in college right now and you're listening to this, first, good on you. Second, maybe it's an opportunity for you to try to be a little bit more involved in your training. I'm not saying to not do your schoolwork, but it could be an environment. It could be an environment where you could really pursue, like a little bit more of both that athletic and, the academic stuff at the same time.
Well, that's of course to say that if that individual is not having to hold a full-time job to continue to pay for college
Yeah.
at that point too,
Yeah.
it's, got to put that asterisk next to it just in case, because we're all coming from a little bit of a different scenario. But
For sure.
it's just one of those where I love my athletes' long-term goals, but I often really like them to focus on the short-term goals. Let me kind of compete with the long-term goals with the short-term goals in visibility right now. Because the problem is, I do have a couple of athletes that look at that long-term goal. They have one bad session during the week because they see that it's not getting them closer to that overall goal, but yet it gets them closer to the short-term goal, but they don't have sight on that. then that one workout they deem as a bad workout that leads into a second, third, or fourth bad workout that then does interrupt that development to the short-term goal, which of course is going to interrupt the development to the long-term goal.
Mm-hmm.
So I often, okay, it's fine to put your long-term goals down, but then we need to build that structure for a short-term goal analysis, that's where your focus lies. And if you continue to check the boxes off on the short-term goals,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to get to that long-term destination. It's just we have to do the small work first. And
Yes.
often when you look at that, like my brain, when you're talking about your uncle getting to that point of a 5 mile, I'm breaking that up into, okay, here's what the next 3 weeks, here's what the next 3 weeks
Mm-hmm.
after that. Most people probably hear that and they're looking at more of the, instead of a microcycle, they're looking at the entire phase of, oh, and then it just becomes overwhelming too.
Mm-hmm.
But I like things in that small, because that's how you progress and that's
Mm-hmm.
how you can stay focused. And it's much, much easier to get up that ladder by taking things in small segments than just always looking at that long-term goal and evaluating, well, did I make up this percentage to get to that goal? No, well, but did you hit that? Did you step on that first step? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
we can move to the next step.
Mm-hmm.
Then we can go to the next step. But often our bodies, our time, our everything that is involved in our day-to-day life does not create, or it does not get us moving forward by jumping 4 or 5 steps at one time.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, when we have those greatest jumps are when we are adolescent and we are first exposed to something fairly new. We start to develop it at a very, very fresh sight. We pick up the technique, we pick up the movement principle, and it just happens that we go from here to here.
Mm-hmm.
As we grow old and we have to recondition certain things, it is just small incremental steps. And I think that that's an important thing to address, is we have to always make it insight, set, check, like boxes to check. And that's just going to be minimal progression. It's not
Mm-hmm.
going to be, hey, last week I was putting 250 watts for 5 minutes. I was feeling pretty tired towards the end of it. Next week, you're not going to be putting 250 watts for 45 minutes. It's just
Right.
not the way that the body develops.
Right.
We're going to have to continue to tick onto that. So it's, I would reiterate that kind of the moral of what we're talking about is setting these small points along the way that you place more of your focus on to progress through the process to get to where you feel like you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay if the timeline that you first set up, you don't make it by that timeline, because it is just a guesstimate.
Mm-hmm.
We can step back, reset up that plan, get that plan in place, that protocol in place, and then start to move the needle again. It might take 3 or 4 different redrawings of that same picture to get you to where you want to go, but it's being smart enough to recognize, this is what really worked for me, this is what didn't. Let me start to utilize what works well for me to be my benefit, while still getting some of these things exposure to that didn't necessarily move the needle. Keeps it somewhat, like, keeps it relevant. Mm-hmm. But sharpen your razor with what works the best.
Yeah. And I think next week we're going to talk about goal setting, and this is a perfect kind of segue into it. But what I kind of came away from that conversation is that people seem to be really bad at having an idea of what they're capable of long term. But what we can do as individuals is we can control what's happening in the short term. And it's funny how it seems like all these conversations that we have are cyclical. We started out, and got off track. I was talking to you about, Meg, and like, oh, well, we need to control what we can control. And here we are now talking 49 minutes later, how we need to control what we can control. And, it's, if you're trying to be the best version of yourself, and that's, I think, what everybody needs to strive for. Don't try to be the Eliud Kipchoge yourself of Eliud Kipchoge, right? Like, maybe take motivation from it, right? If you're feeling down, watch a video of him, he's like, yeah, I get up every day and I do this. Okay. Use that as motivation then to drive yourself to develop those habits, to develop those short-term things. What do I need to do? What are the 3 things I need to do today that are going to move the dial just a little bit in the positive direction? And something that always like that reminded me of was this graph. And it's, just this graph of either having progress or graph of, decay, essentially. And, in the beginning, right, when you really zoom in on it, it's like, if you're improving 0.5% a day, it doesn't really look like that graph is changing over time. But then as you get months, days, months, years, decades, that 1%, that 0.5% compounds exponentially. So you see this like crazy inflection point. And that's where those pros are at, right? They're at that inflection point of, well, when I improve 1%, that's where I'm getting to. Right now, you just need to, but if you then zoom in on the pros' progress, from a week to week perspective or whatever it is, it doesn't seem that steep. It doesn't seem like it's that much. So that's the same thing with you, right? As the athlete, is you just need to remember that, progress, you have to be consistent, specific, and progressive, right? Consistency is going to lead to slow progress over time, which is then going to allow you to progress how hard you're going, which is then going to allow you to get better. And I think, yeah, that's what it comes down to, is we can use the pros as, maybe like for dreams and idols and other things like that, but don't let that let it inform how you train, but don't let it affect how you make decisions and how you're developing your habits. Because if you fall into that trap and you try to become a pro before you're even, like the top of the age group, then you're going to run into a lot of the pitfalls of overtraining and not being motivated and other things like that.
And a lot of what they do is, I mean, they're making a livelihood out of their profession. Just like somebody might be an accountant, your livelihood is that. And there's certain things that you might be exposed to in your job that other individuals outside of that industry might not either be able to get their hands on or don't fully understand. Mm-hmm. They have their hands on certain things that you might not get your hands on or that you fully understand. So I think that is a great point, Phil, that utilize it for motivation, but the other portions of it, you taking lactate or doing other things, if you don't know how to connect the dots with that, you're just dumping money down a system that you're not going to get good information from. And you're also not going to move your personal needle to being your personal best. Mm-hmm. So it's really taking sight and scope on what is going to be best for you. What's your best practice? And sometimes you do have to just step back, be real with yourself and say, well, you know what? I probably do not have the knowledge to take lactate. I don't want to spend $125 in test strips a month to get quality lactate numbers to train towards lactate, just as an example.
Right.
I don't probably need to train that way. Right. Maybe I should go to something that's more manageable. I can afford a Polar H10 heart rate monitor. Mm-hmm. I know roughly where my zones are. If I want to spend money to go into a laboratory to get those even more precise towards me, that's something I can do. And then I can track that on a day-to-day workout to workout basis. Mm-hmm. Do the small blocking and tackling. And I used this analogy yesterday with somebody. I guess I was in a football mood, but I was like, if you block you can start to run the football. If you run the football, you can start to pass the football. And then you have multiple things that you can like start to attack in that case.
Mm-hmm.
If you do the small things, that's going to allow you to take that next jump and take advantage of that next style of training.
Mm-hmm.
If you are doing both of those things, then there's going to be a third level of training that you're going to be able to then implement and take advantage of. So it all starts with the foundation work. We can't build a house on sand. We have to build it on concrete or solid foundation. And if you can't put that down, everything else is just going to be built on a very unstable, likely broken, or it will break in the long term if you don't build it on something solid. So, I mean, long story short is just start with the small things. Do what you, I mean, just do the small things that allows you to then maybe 6 months, 10 months, 2 years down the road, you can then maybe throw one of those workouts or a couple of practices from something that you read in a professional athlete's weekly distribution. That's great. But there's no point in saying, you know what? I can't do this, but I'm going to go do that.
Right. Yeah. I think that that's a really good stopping point. And Aaron and I will continue to talk about those fundamentals. What are those fundamentals? Because it's not like being a good endurance athlete is not just training correctly. It's recovering correctly. It's nutrition, it's sleep, it's strength training. It's all of these different things. And we want to help teach you how to utilize those tools to the best of your ability, so that when you do see something like the Norwegian method, right, and you're like, oh, I'm kind of interested in that, let's see if it would actually help me, you can do the problem solving. You can say, okay, well, realistically, I'm not Jakob Ingebrigtsen. I'm not going to be doing, I don't even know what their crazy workouts are, but there's some of them are pretty insane. Like, 6x1K at, like 3.5 millimole of lactate. Like, I'm not going to be doing that, but what I can do is I could do 3, and I could do it at the pace that I'd be running for my race. So that's, at least like from my perspective, that's why I love having these conversations with Aaron, is because we have the ability to say, okay, well, we know what the research says, but like now from a coaching perspective, how do we actually take that and how do we apply it to ourselves individually? So over the course of the next, I don't know, number of podcasts and everything, we'll teach fundamentals. We'll do things like, walking you through goal setting. Because I have a lot of work, at least in my PhD, with like SMART goals and how to set up, like timely goals that are actually going to be specific enough that you can create habits that are then going to help you get that 0.5% increase in or improvement, week to week to week over time. So I think that's where we're headed. That's the next direction. But for now, you can always find me at Critical02 on Instagram. You can find Aaron on Instagram at Try a Geiser. And if you guys have any questions, DM us, leave comments down in the YouTube comments down below, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.
If I can say one thing, I've had a number of people reach out since the podcast has been released, and I love the positive comments. So please keep them coming. I appreciate you guys reaching out. It really, reiterates why we're doing this, Phil.
Yeah. It always puts a smile on my face. And I told Aaron, I don't know if I've said it on the podcast, but if I was able just to have these conversations, then that would be enough for me. But the fact that we get to share these and people actually find them valuable and are letting us know, that means, even more to both of us. So we really appreciate like all the kind comments, even if they're not, super kind. Leave us constructive criticism, and we'll do our best to try to fix things, because we're always trying to grow and be better. But yeah, we appreciate all of the positive feedback. And as we record this, it's still early on in like the publishing and stuff. So hopefully we'll continue to get better with our delivery, with our back and forth, with the way we edit and make the sound of the podcast and all of that. But we're always that's why we're here. We're here to help people get better. So,
and Phil, I think you just kind of talked about us progressing as well. So
yeah, exactly.
We talked about progression, so that's all it is.
Yeah,
we're progressing through specificity.
Yep, exactly. All right, guys, we'll catch you later.